My name is Tenzin, and together with my wife, we own and operate Red Door Family Farm here in Athens, Wisconsin, and we're a small, diversified, primarily vegetable and fruit farm. Or we're cultivating about 15 acres of land, probably 11 or 12 acres of vegetables and fruits, along with some pork and poultry and eggs.
So my first question to you is, how would warming temperatures affect your industry, such as workers, employees, consumers, your community?
So, warming temperatures have affected our industry in a lot of ways. The biggest one by far, and what keeps coming up at every different veggie growers conference and thing like that we go to, is weather patterns. So, obviously, warming temperatures creates bigger rain events here in the Midwest, at least. Creates bigger rain events where we get more rain in a shorter period of time, and it's sort of just more volatile. So it makes it much more difficult to plan around. We're getting 100-year weather events year after year after year in a lot of communities. So that's by far the biggest challenge. Along with that come things like supply chain disruptions and possible crop contamination. So anytime you have surface water flooding a field, none of that, even if you get those things to finish out and be harvestable, they're condemned because you've now had surface water contamination, so they're not considered safe to sell, which is, I think, smart, but I think a lot of people don't realize that a flooded field can mean that not only can it be a challenge to growing and to resource conservation, but it also can just annihilate a crop. Those are sort of the big things, but by far, I think, the biggest problem is rain events. So we're getting, occasionally we get drier spells than we normally do here in the Midwest, and that's a challenge, but that's a relatively easy challenge to work around for farmers. You can add water, but you can't take it away in most cases. We're only on our 7th year farming here, and one of the farms that we've really looked up to and modeled ourselves after, they have decided to shut up shop. And they were already on sort of a retirement track and scaling down, but they decided to do it earlier. They said they had 18 inches of rain in about the span of a month this year. Whereas right here, we didn't see that this year. And they're only, 2 hours to the west of us. But we have these small pockets, and it's just, if it hits you, it hits you, and there's not a whole lot to do about it in the immediate sense, certainly. And I know the Madison area has been hit really hard, not so much this past season, but the 2 previous summers, they had just tons and tons of flooding down there. I saw pictures of tomato plants this tall that were halfway underwater, just heart-wrenching stuff. And it's really hard to farm, obviously, in those conditions, and it's hard enough to keep a farm viable, let alone when you've got to weather those sorts of storms. But it also further creates problems with erosion and soil depletion, nutrient depletion, which build and make longer term problems and affect your fertility.
Like with warmer temperatures, we're going to see more pest and disease growth. How would that affect the farming industry?
Yeah, that's very much true, and I would say to a lesser, it's less of an immediate threat than the severe weather patterns, but it's also ongoing, and we are looking so there's plant hardiness zones, and there's a tiny little finger of zone 3 that comes down and it feels like it loops around the farm and goes back north, but so we consider ourselves zone 3. Madison already is zone 5, so there's not a very large geographical area between these zones, especially here right around the Great Lakes. We are already seeing an increase in invasive pests that can overwinter. So we a lot of times talk to friends in Madison, maybe as far down south as Missouri, that are all part of the same sort of networking groups where we really bounce ideas off of each other and work together to solve these bigger problems. And they say, well, how do you control for this pest or that pest? And honestly, we're way up north, and we have the short growing season, which is why we use high tunnels to extend that growing season. for us to control for pests in the high tunnels, what we do is we just open the sides for a week or two in February and freeze it out really hard. And that seems to negate pest pressure, but that's becoming less and less possible. And this last year we had a huge problem with cabbage moths, which aren't new to the area, but they weren't able to overwinter in the sorts of populations that we saw this last year because we had a milder winter last year.
So can you get more in depth into how farmers, even what you've had to do in order to combat a lot of these problems?
Yeah, so that's really one of my personal passions, is how do we address this? Obviously we need to address climate change through federal policy, Paris Climate Accord, and all those sorts of things. Major comprehensive things need to happen because it's a global problem. But meanwhile, here on the farm, what can we do? And teaming up with other farmers. So I'm part of 2 different groups that are really researching that in our area. There's not a ton of applicable research out there. And the main thing that we can do is we can improve the health of our soil. And because this does 2 things. One is it sequesters carbon in the soil, which pulls it out of the atmosphere. So that's important on a global scale, and policy is needed to encourage farmers to do those sorts of practices. The International Panel on Climate Change did a very comprehensive study, and they determined that soil carbon sequestration through good agricultural practices is by far the cheapest way to pull carbon back out of the atmosphere. You get the biggest bang for your buck. It also increases the fertile capacity of the soil, decreases the erosion and other problems that we're facing that have other ecological effects down the chain. So it's absolutely a no-brainer as far as an important thing that we can be doing. But on the farm itself, increasing that carbon content and increasing the diversity of microbial populations living in the soil, which both increases the carbon content but also increases the water holding capacity. When you have healthy soil microbial populations, they will break down decaying plant matter and turn it into sequestered organic matter, which is sequestered carbon in the soil. What that does is it acts like a sponge. So when you get this big weather pattern, the soil can hold more water. It can soak that water up, and it also then can hold it so it's available to plants during a dry period. So you have way less erosion, and you have way less flooding because more of that water can go into the soil, be held for the plants for when they need it. And so that's really what I'm focusing on. The other thing to do is to have growing plants. So live growing plants in the soil suck up a lot of water. So when you get a big deluge of rain, growing plants are going to take that water up, respire it. They're going to help to evaporate that out and to process that water, as well as the carbon content or the organic matter of the soil. And so conventional farming practices for the last, since Dust Bowl era, have contributed to eroding topsoil, which is full of that organic matter. It ends up washing away, blowing away, all these sorts of things, which means that our soils are at the lowest percent organic matter that they've ever been, nationwide, worldwide. Organic farming is really important. It's the base level because you stop killing those soil microbes so completely. So you have to have those soil microbes in order to actually convert the plant tissue into organic matter in the soil. So that's something that needs to happen, is to even start this process. And then after that, there's a whole lot of other practices that can be done. So cover cropping, keeping more living plants growing in the soil, whether that's in between your cash crops or whether that's taking things out of rotation periodically, and turning that matter back into the soil, or allowing the biology to do that, better yet. They're no-till or reduced tillage programs. which is where you're just not agitating the soil so much, so you're not killing mechanically, destroying the habitat of those microbes, but also
By the end of the century, how would the farming industry be impacted for the Midwest if we kept on the same route and didn't go to green energy?
so if we keep going in this direction, by the end of the century, what does it look like for farming in the Midwest? Well, this is a great opportunity to use one of my favorite quotes. Wise man I was fortunate enough to know well at a young age, named Reuben Snake, once told me that if we don't change direction, we're going to wind up where we're headed. And I think that that's exactly right. I think that by the end of the century, and quite frankly, I don't think I can even see that far ahead. I think way sooner than that. I think in the next, within my lifetime, certainly within my children's lifetime, which hopefully they do live to see the end of the century here. But I think we're going to see very volatile weather patterns that leave farming in the Midwest to be a non-starter. I think that farming, as it is now, is already, it's like the most wholesome gambling addiction you can have. uh, and that's even with things being as currently stable as they are, and we're already seeing things getting more and more volatile at a shocking rate. So I would say in the next 20 years, it will be devastating financially if we don't change policies to promote good practices and better insulate farms that aren't doing just sort of the main big things. Those farms, those crop insurance programs are financially very workable for farms. They keep them kind of stuck in debt, but they do keep them operating, and for the most part. But for farms like ours, there is no real crop insurance program that will continue. So we have to rely on being adaptable and having our ducks in a row that way, and having our income be diverse by having many different crops, for example, that come in at different times and things like that. And so I don't see anyone being willing to start a farm like ours even 25 years from now unless things change significantly climatically or in terms of the market, in terms of policy, or technologically. The good news is I think all those things will change, or I'm sure they will. Whether or not they'll change fast enough and for the better enough remains to be seen. So yeah, I think, old farms that are in the habit of waking up and starting again every spring will continue to do that in many cases, but there will be a lot of consolidation, because smaller farms just will not be able to weather the ups and downs, and that will leave all that land available to larger farms. The bigger the farms are, the less responsibly they're farmed. I mean, there's other factors, but that trend basically holds because it's just more land that can't be managed with nuances.
So there's a lot of people that I would say that are in more of your field, the industry field, that are not very aware of the dangers of climate change, or they don't even believe in climate change. What would you say to those people, that, or even like other farmers that are like you, that do not see the threat that we do?
Yeah, I would say that um, I would say that there are very few to none farmers in the Midwest are not aware that the weather is more volatile than it was a decade ago, 2 decades ago. I would also say that best case scenario, some of them are lying to themselves and just in denial. But a bigger problem is sort of this culture of denial that we've created on our political landscape, I think. I think almost all scientists, almost all industries that are really doing their homework agree beyond any shadow of a doubt that there is human caused climate change happening. You can roll the dice that we can get through the next 20 years without getting bit too hard, and that's certainly a strategy. Implementing all of these sort of more responsible things takes a lot of time and a lot of money, um, as far as like a percentage of a farm's operating budget. And that's enough reason for people not to implement strategies. But as far as outright disbelieving it, obviously everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but that doesn't make it right. It is a wrong opinion. It's absolutely happening. And what I would say to people in my field that disagree about climate change is that, Chuck Hasselbrook once told me a story. He's from the Center for Rural Affairs in Nebraska. He said, when you're driving on these country roads, out on gravel roads and stuff, you kind of tend to drive towards the middle of the road, right? Because the gravel is loose, it gets looser towards the end of the road. But when you're coming up a hill, even if you don't know what's on the other side of the hill, you still move over a little bit just in case, right? And I would say that even if you do not believe that climate change is, well, for starters, you need to get better educated about it because it's going to affect you. Mm-hmm. But even if you still have some doubt, let's move over to the side of the road so we don't plow into a foreseeable problem. And many of the things that we can do are small. Changes can be made incrementally. It probably won't be fast enough, but most of those things are going to improve your long-term fertility, improve the health of your soil, improve the health of your farm, improve your long-term financial viability, even if it comes at a short-term cost in terms of time and money. So I think long-term, agronomically speaking, these are sound investments. And most farms are making long-term investments one way or another, whether that's buying an additional parcel of land, hoping that it will, as they farm it, it will also accrue value, or buying a $500,000 tractor and paying on a low interest loan. So farmers aren't not making long-term investments, and it's time to start looking at these things as long-term investments.
So for my last question for you, why do you fight for climate justice?
Well, the short answer is because I refuse to live without hope. I want to be doing something. Anyway, I want to be doing something that has at least the potential to be meaningful in a long-term way. And because I have kids. And if, as we talked about, 25, 50 years from now, farming in the Midwest is basically not viable, I don't want to have to look at them and say that I was part of the problem and I knew better and I did it wrong anyway. I want to look at them and I want to say that we tried to create a farm. And hopefully I'm going to look around at a thriving farm and say, look at all the good things that we did and how it's kept us afloat. But at the very least, I want to be able to look at them and say, we really tried. We really tried. We poured our hearts into this thing. We tried to not only create a farm that is viable in a long-term way, but also to communicate with other people doing this sort of thing. Work together and collaborate and try to come up with economically viable, sound practices and ways to implement them, and real-life data about how they can work on functioning farms, so that as other people want to adopt these practices, they don't have to start from scratch. We are piggybacking off of all kinds of studies and other farms' practices going back hundreds of years, and that information. And information has never been more widely available. So why not use that? Why not try to build something that has the possibility of going on and rippling out and creating good effects? And I mean, I'm not naive enough to think that what we're doing here on the farm is going to alter global climate change in any significant way. What I would like anyone who watches this documentary to know is that it's really important to vote with your dollar or vote with your fork or however you want to say that. That is what makes farms like ours possible. Is that people care about where their food comes from, that people care about what's happening in their community as a result of producing that food. We tend to think that ecological justice or ecological improvement comes at the expense of the economy. And that's just a mindset that's been kind of cooked into our heads mostly through political rhetoric, I would frankly say. It doesn't have to be that way. There are very real, tangible things that we can do to promote good practices, both economically and ecologically, within our community. And we need to do that, and we need to pay attention to doing that. And you will get healthier, fresher food. You'll feel better. You'll be not only investing in your own and your family's immediate health, but investing in the economic health of your community, the ecological health of your community, and creating that opportunity for farms like ours to exist, to continue to thrive, and to continue to make long-term investments.